In this shop, every book has a curse and a body count. Welcome to Warm Leaves. I am your host, Raven. Tell me where you're listening from. Your voices keep these mysteries alive. Now let's open the cover. The rain had started just before dusk, a steady drizzle that slicked the cobblestone streets of St. Mildred's and blurred the glow of the street lamps into watery halos. Miss Marple, who had come down from St. Mary Mead to visit an old friend, paused under the awning of a quaint little shop on Whitcomb Lane. The painted sign above the door read, "Farnsworth's Antiquarian Books," its gold lettering faded and curling at the edges. The scent of damp paper and old leather drifted from the open doorway, drawing her in as naturally as a teapot on a rainy afternoon. The bell over the door gave a tired chime as she stepped inside. Rows of tall, uneven bookcases loomed in the narrow space, each groaning under the weight of dusty tomes. At the far end, a small counter was half buried under ledgers, teacups, and precarious stacks of books that looked ready to topple at the slightest touch. Behind it stood Mr. Farnsworth himself, a thin man with watery eyes and a voice like dry parchment. Miss Marple exchanged a few polite words with him. How dreadful the weather had been lately, how the tourists were dwindling, and was about to browse when a sudden commotion came from upstairs. It was sharp and abrupt, like furniture scraping violently across the floor, followed by a muffled thud. Mr. Farnsworth's expression drained of color. Without a word, he hurried to a narrow staircase at the back. Curiosity and a sense of something amiss compelled Miss Marple to follow. The staircase creaked alarmingly as they ascended to the upper floor. It was a cramped loft, smelling faintly of ink and candle wax, with a single window looking out over the rain-slick street. In the center of the room lay a man, sprawled unnaturally across the floorboards. Even at a glance, Miss Marple could see he was beyond help. His eyes were glassy, his face pale, and a peculiar dark stain was spreading on his shirt. What caught her attention, however, was not the death itself, but the setting. The room was locked from the inside. Mr. Farnsworth stammered that the man was Mr. Daniel Hartwell, a rare book dealer from London, who had come earlier in the afternoon to view a particularly old volume. On the desk nearby lay the book in question, a heavy, black-bound grimoire with gilt lettering that read, "De Occultis Mortis." But what seemed stranger still was that a single page had been torn out and was nowhere to be seen. The police arrived shortly after. Detective Inspector Graves among them, a man who wore his skepticism like an overcoat. He examined the scene briskly, his eyes scanning the locked door, the lone window, latched from within, and the strange book on the desk. "No sign of forced entry," he said at last, his tone suggesting he found the situation more irritating than baffling. "And everyone downstairs swears no one came up. Our man seems to have died alone. Could be poison, could be fright." Miss Marple, standing quietly by the window, noticed something Graves did not. On the floor just beyond the victim's hand lay a small object, a dried violet petal. It was entirely out of place in the musty loft. She bent slowly, as if straightening her skirt, and let her sharp eyes linger on it. "What an unusual detail," she murmured to herself. The other clue, if it could be called one, was even stranger. On the desk beside the black-bound book was a small cup of tea, untouched, its surface faintly filmed over. But there was no second cup, and no sign anyone else had been sharing the room. The inspector grumbled that it might be suicide, but Miss Marple knew better. The position of the body, the missing page, the locked door, all of it suggested intent. She thought of the violet petal again. She had seen such flowers pinned to the lapels of gentlemen before, but she had also seen them pressed into the covers of certain books as markers. The shop was searched top to bottom. The missing page never turned up, nor did any weapon. Only a faint smell, sharp, metallic, lingered near the desk, which Miss Marple quietly noted but did not mention aloud. The official theory remained unsatisfying. How could a man enter a locked room, kill another, and vanish without a trace? And why take only one page from a book that seemed otherwise intact? As the rain eased outside, Miss Marple felt a slow certainty building in her mind. The crime was not as impossible as it appeared. Such things rarely were. But the solution would not be found in the obvious. It would be tucked away, like a dangerous secret between the covers of an old book, waiting for someone patient enough to read between the lines. She turned her attention back to the counter below, to Mr. Farnsworth's anxious glances, to the oddly specific arrangement of books behind him. Somewhere in this little shop of black magic and death, the truth was waiting, and she intended to find it. Inspector Graves wasted no time clearing the loft. He ordered Hartwell's body to be examined by the coroner, the strange book to be bagged as evidence, and the room to be sealed until morning. To most, that seemed the end of the matter for the evening, but Miss Marple, with her mild expression and quiet persistence, lingered by the counter as the police made their way out into the damp street. She did not follow them. Instead, she drifted back toward the shelves, her gloved fingers brushing lightly over the spines of the books. Mr. Farnsworth, still pale and shaken, looked as though he wanted very much to ask her to leave, but politeness, or perhaps nervousness, kept him silent. Miss Marple spoke in her gentle voice, the one that sounded like idle chatter but never was. "Such an interesting customer, Mr. Hartwell. Did you know him well?" "Only by name," Farnsworth replied quickly, a little too quickly. "He sent a letter last week inquiring about certain rarities. It is not unusual for collectors to travel here." Her eyes moved from his face to the counter, where a slip of paper lay partly hidden under a ledger. Most people would have overlooked it, but she noticed the faint indentation of fresh handwriting, the way one edge was still damp from a spill. And he was interested in that particular book upstairs. "Yes," Farnsworth said, hesitating for half a beat. "The De Occultis Mortis. A curiosity only. Dangerous nonsense, of course. I told him as much." Miss Marple smiled faintly, as though the conversation was about knitting patterns, but her eyes flicked to the shelf behind him. On the third row, half concealed among the faded bindings, she noticed a slim volume bound in pale blue. A modern reprint, incongruous among the antiques, and just above it, pressed against the wall, a single pressed violet pinned neatly to the edge of the wood. She let her gaze rest there only a moment before turning away. "Such books often have histories of their own," she said mildly. Graves returned briefly, frowning as though the case were a troublesome splinter. "We've locked the shop for the night. Farnsworth, you'll be called to the inquest. Miss Marple, I trust you've seen enough of our little mystery." "Oh, yes," she said, her voice as mild as ever. "Quite enough to think it worth staying a little longer." Graves grunted, muttering something about amateurs, and left. Once the shop was quiet again, Miss Marple asked if she might look over the ground floor. Farnsworth agreed reluctantly, shadowing her like a nervous cat. She moved slowly, as if merely admiring the haphazard order of the shelves, but her sharp eyes took in the dust patterns on the floor, the faint scuff of a shoe that did not match Farnsworth's own neat tread, and the way certain books had been hastily rearranged, as though something had been hidden or retrieved in a hurry. Her attention settled on a low shelf near the staircase, a space that was oddly empty, the dust disturbed. She knelt, running a finger lightly along the wood. "One hates to see gaps in a collection," she murmured. Farnsworth made a nervous sound. "That shelf is awaiting restoration. The volumes were damaged." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh, I quite understand. One often puts things away for safekeeping." Before he could reply, the door opened. A tall woman in a rain-spotted coat stepped inside, her hat pulled low. She looked around as though surprised to see the shop still open, then spotted Farnsworth and relaxed. Too much. "You're still here," she said, her tone warm but edged. Farnsworth stiffened. "Miss Ellery." I didn't expect. I was worried about the book, she said quickly. I heard there was trouble. Miss Marple, unnoticed for the moment, observed the exchange. Miss Ellery's gloves were damp, but her coat cuffs were dry. A small detail, but one that suggested she had been somewhere sheltered before arriving here. Her gaze flicked briefly toward the staircase, then back to Farnsworth. I assure you, Farnsworth said, forcing a smile, everything is in order. Miss Marple stepped forward with a kind expression. A dreadful business, isn't it? I'm Miss Marple. Were you acquainted with Mr. Hartwell? Miss Ellery hesitated, just long enough to betray calculation. No, not exactly. I met him once at an auction in London. He was bidding on the same lot I was. Her tone was too casual. Miss Marple's years in St. Mary Mead had taught her to recognize that particular strain of half-truth, the sort spoken by someone with something to lose. The conversation ended soon after, with Miss Ellery leaving in haste, promising to return another day. But the moment the door closed, Miss Marple allowed her expression to change. She had noted the quick glance at the staircase, the way Farnsworth's hands had trembled slightly when Ellery spoke of the book, and, most telling of all, the faint scent of crushed violets that lingered after she left. Something was beginning to form in her mind. Not a solution, not yet, but a pattern. There was deception here, and it was bound up in the missing page, the violet, and the curious way both Farnsworth and Miss Ellery reacted whenever De Occultis Mortis was mentioned. Miss Marple glanced once more at the pale blue book on the shelf, and the single violet pinned above it. Such things were rarely placed by accident. She tucked the observation quietly away, ready to bring it forward when the moment was right. The night deepened, the rain tapping softly against the windows. Miss Marple knew the next step would not be found in obvious statements or police reports. It would be in watching, waiting, and catching the smallest of slips. And people, she knew from long experience, all morning came grey and wet, the rain leaving a pale mist that clung to the narrow streets. Inspector Graves returned to Farnsworth's antiquarian books with a notebook in hand, and a scowl that suggested the case had already begun to irritate him. Miss Marple, of course, had arrived early, ostensibly to browse, but she had positioned herself near the counter in a way that allowed her to hear every word of the questioning. Farnsworth was first. He looked gaunt in the daylight, his voice soft but hurried, as if he hoped to get the unpleasantness over with. Hartwell came at 2 in the afternoon, he began. He examined the book, made a few notes, and we agreed on a price. I left him upstairs to look at it further, but I swear I never went back until we heard the noise. Graves leaned on the counter. Who else was here? No one until Miss Ellery arrived, shortly before 5, and she didn't go upstairs. We only spoke briefly. Miss Marple tilted her head. It was curious, she thought, how certain people always remembered time so precisely, unless, of course, they wanted their alibis to sound neat. Next was Miss Ellery, who arrived punctually, a faint perfume of violets preceding her. She removed her gloves with measured grace, answering questions as if she'd rehearsed them. I came to check on a book Mr. Farnsworth had promised to hold for me. I was surprised to find the police here. I never met Mr. Hartwell privately. We were merely rival bidders once at Sotheby's. He was intense about his acquisitions. Did you see him yesterday? Graves asked. Not at all. Miss Marple, watching her closely, noticed the way Miss Ellery's eyes flicked just once toward the staircase. And when she spoke of Hartwell's intensity, there was the smallest tightening at the corner of her mouth. Not grief, certainly not shock. Something else. Wariness, perhaps. After Ellery came Mr. Gilbert Price, the young assistant who managed deliveries. He was all awkward energy, twisting his cap in his hands as he spoke. I was here most of the day, sir. Packed a few parcels, sent one to Bath, another to Exeter. I didn't hear much from upstairs, just a sort of dull thump late in the afternoon. "You didn't check it out?" Graves asked. Price shook his head. "Didn't seem my place, sir. Mr. Farnsworth handles customers himself." Miss Marple noticed his boots were muddied in an odd pattern, thick along the sides, clean on the soles, as though he had been standing still in a wet place rather than walking through it. Finally, Mrs. Broom, the shop's housekeeper, was brought in. She was a brisk woman in her 50s, with the air of one who saw everything but commented on nothing. "I clean the back rooms on Wednesdays," she said firmly. "Yesterday I was in the kitchen most of the afternoon. I saw Mr. Hartwell arrive. A polite man, if a bit distracted. Miss Ellery came later, and yes, I heard the noise, but I didn't see anyone else." Her tone was straightforward, but Miss Marple's years of village life had taught her that even straightforward women sometimes left things unsaid. The key was to notice what they didn't mention. Mrs. Broom, for instance, had said nothing about whether Miss Ellery went upstairs, or whether she herself had stepped into the loft. Graves finished his questioning, dissatisfied but unwilling to admit it. Each account matched the broad strokes: Hartwell alone in the loft, a noise, and then the discovery of his body. But the details, times, movements, and small hesitations, were less tidy. Miss Marple, in her quiet way, began to knit as the inspector spoke to himself in frustration. It gave her the perfect excuse to remain near enough to hear. She began to sort through what she had heard, comparing each voice, each story. Farnsworth claimed Ellery had not gone upstairs. Ellery had said she never met Hartwell privately. Price had placed himself conveniently in the back rooms, away from view. And Mrs. Broom had been in the kitchen with no one to confirm her movements. There was truth in each statement, but not the whole truth. And Miss Marple, who had seen many such performances over teacups in St. Mary Mead, knew the difference between honesty and precision. People often told the truth in ways that served themselves best. She remembered the pressed violet upstairs, the faint scent that lingered when Miss Ellery departed, and the blue book out of place among Farnsworth's collection. She thought of Price's oddly muddied boots, and of Mrs. Broom's careful omission. The contradictions were small now, like loose threads in a tapestry. But Miss Marple had learned that if one tugged at just the right one, the whole picture might change entirely. And she intended to tug, quietly, patiently, until the pattern revealed itself. As the witnesses left one by one, Miss Marple's eyes followed them. She had no intention of confronting anyone yet, so that would come later. For now, she only needed to watch. And she did, with the calm certainty of someone who had seen far more tangled mysteries unravel under less patient hands. Ways slipped, especially when they thought the keenest eyes had already left the room. By the following afternoon, the air in St. Mildred's seemed to carry a charge of certainty. Inspector Graves arrived at the bookshop wearing the expression of a man who believed his work was nearly done. "A breakthrough, Miss Marple," he said, with the air of one presenting a solved crossword. The coroner found traces of belladonna in Hartwell's system. Poison. And what did we find this morning? A packet of dried violet petals, laced with the same toxin, in Miss Ellery's lodgings, alongside a letter from Hartwell threatening legal action over a disputed book sale. Motive and means. Miss Marple, seated in a high-backed chair near the counter, looked up from her knitting. "Oh my, that does sound very convincing." Convincing it did sound, and Graves wasted no time making it sound more so. He had Miss Ellery brought in under arrest, the small packet of petals sealed in an evidence bag for all to see. She protested with controlled indignation, claiming the violets were part of her work. She pressed flowers for botanical prints, she explained, and the letter was no more than Hartwell's usual bluster. But the inspector was unmoved. "To my mind, that settles it," Graves said, adjusting his hat. "Poison in her possession, quarrel with the victim. Case closed." Farnsworth seemed relieved. too relieved. "Dreadful business," he murmured, though his eyes darted nervously toward the staircase, as though fearful the loft itself might overhear. Price, the assistant, tried to hide a smirk that was quickly smothered under a show of solemnity. Mrs. Broom polished the counter with unusual vigor, saying nothing at all. Miss Marple, however, remained seated, her knitting needles moving with steady precision. "It is curious," she said softly, "how these things come together so neatly. It does make one wonder, why?" Graves gave her a look of mild irritation. "Why? Because the evidence is clear." "And yet," Miss Marple continued as if musing to herself, "the violets upstairs in the loft, the single petal on the floor near Mr. Hartwell's hand, were fresh. These in Miss Ellery's rooms were dried and stored away. I suppose it is possible she would bring her own pressed petals all this way simply to scatter one in the loft, though it would be a strange sort of carelessness for someone so precise." Graves frowned. "You think it planted?" "Oh, dear me, I never think anything until all the facts are in," Miss Marple replied mildly. "I only note how quickly we have arrived at an answer, almost as if the answer were waiting for us to find it." Her words hung in the air, unsettling in their gentleness. Ellery was taken away, the inspector satisfied he had his culprit. The townsfolk, eager for resolution, began speaking of the matter as finished. But Miss Marple could feel it, the subtle wrongness of a case tied up too soon. That evening she returned quietly to the shop, ostensibly to look over a gardening book Mrs. Broom had promised to find for her. The shop was nearly empty, the mist outside thickening again. Price was stacking books near the door, humming tunelessly. Farnsworth was in the back room, rummaging through a drawer. As Miss Marple moved among the shelves, she let her fingers trail along the spines again, her eyes scanning for the pale blue book she had noticed before. It was gone. In its place, the faint outline of dust on the shelf showed where it had been. Her eyes softened, though her mind sharpened. The removal of that single book told her more than any bold confession might have. Someone in the shop was still moving pieces, adjusting details after the supposed solution had been found. She turned to leave, her voice gentle as ever when she wished Mr. Farnsworth a good evening. But her thoughts were already steps ahead. The true culprit had not stopped working simply because the police believed the case closed. In fact, this was exactly the moment when such a person would feel safest to act again. Miss Marple paused at the door, glancing once more at the staircase to the loft. The shadows there seemed deeper now, as if holding on to some quiet secret. She smiled faintly to herself. Things were not over. Not yet. The following morning broke cold and bright, the rain having washed the streets clean. Yet inside Farnsworth's antiquarian books, the air felt heavier than ever. Miss Marple stepped inside as the bell chimed, her manner perfectly unassuming, though her mind was busy sorting through half-formed connections. The shop seemed quieter in Ellery's absence. Farnsworth greeted her with forced cheer, though his eyes betrayed the strain of someone holding himself, together by habit alone. Price busied himself at the counter, avoiding her gaze, while Mrs. Broom was nowhere in sight. Miss Marple's interest was piqued not by what was present, but by what was missing. The pale blue book she had noted before had not returned, nor had the pressed violet pinned above the shelf. In her long life, she had learned that people rarely move things without reason. She allowed her eyes to drift toward the loft stairs. "Such a terrible business, Mr. Farnsworth," she said mildly. "And poor Miss Ellery. So unfortunate for her to be caught in such a misunderstanding. I do hope things will clear up." Farnsworth's lips tightened. The inspector believes the matter closed. "Yes, so he does," Miss Marple said. "But you know, these little mysteries often have a habit of reaching further back than one expects, sometimes years. I remember a case in St. Mary Mead, quite different, of course, where an argument over a teapot in 1922 ended up explaining a death in 1947. Quite remarkable how long certain resentments can simmer. At that moment, the shop door opened, and Mrs. Broom appeared with a basket of groceries. "Morning, Mr. Farnsworth. Miss Marple," she said, inclining her head politely. Miss Marple's keen eyes caught something in the exchange between Mrs. Broom and Price. A fleeting glance, quickly averted. Not hostility, but something like shared wariness. Miss Marple, still in her softest voice, asked, "How long have you been here at the shop, Mrs. Broom? You must have seen many interesting visitors." "Over 20 years, Mrs. Broom replied briskly. "Long enough to know most of the customers by sight. Mr. Hartwell I'd seen before too. He came here once. Oh, must be 15 years ago, before young Price worked here. Back then he was sniffing about the same book, if memory serves." Miss Marple stilled her knitting just enough to catch the tone. "The De Occultis Mortis?" Mrs. Broom nodded. "That's the one. Caused quite a stir. Another dealer came looking for it too. They argued, loud enough for the whole street to hear. Fellow by the name of Ellery. Miss Ellery's father." Farnsworth's head snapped up. "That's ancient history, Mrs. Broom." "Ancient history has a way of showing up in the present," Miss Marple murmured, her voice light, but her mind sharpening like a blade. A forgotten quarrel, a book that had changed hands, or perhaps never had, and a family name that tied the victim and the accused together far earlier than anyone had admitted. As Mrs. Broom moved toward the back room, Miss Marple caught sight of something tucked under the counter near Price's elbow. A folded scrap of parchment, browned with age. Price noticed her gaze and quickly slid it out of sight. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "My, you are careful with your papers, Mr. Price. Such a valuable habit in a bookshop." Price flushed, muttering something about invoices. But Miss Marple had seen enough to know it was no invoice. The edges were too brittle, too old. A missing page, perhaps? One that someone had reason to keep hidden. As she stepped outside into the cold sunlight, her thoughts turned inward. Hartwell's death was not a sudden quarrel over a book. It was the final movement of something that had begun years earlier, an unresolved dispute that had ensnared Farnsworth, Ellery, and perhaps even the quiet Mrs. Broom. And Price, young as he was, had inherited some part of it, whether knowingly or not. The roots of the crime were buried deep. And in Miss Marple's experience, such roots always had a way of breaking the surface again when one least expected it. Miss Marple returned to Farnsworth's antiquarian books the next afternoon under the most innocent pretext imaginable. She carried with her a small paper parcel tied neatly with string. "I thought you might enjoy this, Mr. Farnsworth," she said pleasantly, setting it on the counter. "A copy of The Language of Flowers. It's quite an old edition, though not rare, I'm afraid. I remembered how fond you seemed of violets." Farnsworth's eyes flickered ever so slightly at the word. "Violets? I don't believe—" "Oh, I must be mistaken," Miss Marple interrupted cheerfully. "It is just that I noticed one pinned to the shelf upstairs. Such a sentimental flower. They often mark moments we'd rather not forget. Or perhaps," she added softly, "moments we cannot afford to forget." Price, stacking books in the corner, nearly dropped the pile in his hands. Farnsworth gave him a sharp look, then busied himself untying the string on the parcel, his fingers stiff. Miss Marple, with all the appearance of a harmless old lady, wandered toward the staircase. "May I peek upstairs again, just for a moment? I do so like the atmosphere of the loft. It's almost like stepping into a different time." Farnsworth hesitated, then nodded. Price looked as though he wished to object, but bit his tongue. In the loft, the black-bound De Occultis Mortis still lay on the desk, though the inspector had sealed it with red wax. Miss Marple did not touch it. Instead, she examined the empty space on the shelf where the pale blue book had been, and, quite deliberately, set the flower book down in its place. Then she descended and began speaking idly to Mrs. Broom, who had just come in. "Do you know, Mrs. Broom, in my village there was once a case where a missing letter was found because the culprit could not resist putting a book back in its proper place. Old habits, you see. People will risk much to keep things orderly, even when they ought not to." Mrs. Broom made a non-committal sound, but Miss Marple saw her glance at the staircase in precisely the same quick, anxious way Farnsworth had earlier. Miss Marple smiled. So many secrets in books. Why, one could almost imagine a missing page or two tucked safely away somewhere close, at hand. Price dropped another stack of books. "Sorry, Miss Marple. Clumsy today," he muttered. But the color in his cheeks deepened. Miss Marple said nothing more. She simply took her leave, her little flower book left in the loft. That evening she returned quietly, ostensibly to retrieve it. The shop was dimly lit, nearly empty. Farnsworth was in the back room. Price was gone. Mrs. Broom was tidying the counter. Miss Marple ascended the staircase without a word. As she had expected, her book was gone from the shelf, and in its place the pale blue volume had returned. She smiled to herself. Someone, unable to bear the disorder, had moved it back. She opened it gently. Between its pages was a brittle sheet of parchment, the missing page from De Occultis Mortis. Footsteps creaked on the stairs behind her. Farnsworth's voice came, low and strained. "Miss Marple, I can explain." She turned, her expression perfectly mild. "Oh, I'm sure you can, Mr. Farnsworth. But the thing about explanations is, they have a way of sounding very different depending on when they are offered." In that moment, she had all the confirmation she needed. Not of guilt in the precise sense the inspector would demand, but of deception. Farnsworth's tidy instinct, his inability to leave a shelf out of order, had betrayed him. She descended, carrying the pale blue book, and set it on the counter before Mrs. Broom. "I believe this belongs here," she said gently, though one wonders why it ever left. Mrs. Broom's hands trembled slightly. Farnsworth said nothing. Price reappeared in the doorway, pale as paper. Miss Marple smiled in her grandmotherly way. "It is the smallest habits that reveal the greatest truths. Don't you think so?" The following morning brought a sharp wind that rattled the shop's windows, as if the weather itself sensed something restless inside. Miss Marple arrived early, her gloves neatly buttoned, her expression as mild as ever. She intended to place the pale blue book, the one with the missing page, safely into Inspector Graves' hands before anyone had the chance to tidy it away again. But the moment she stepped inside, she knew something was wrong. The book was gone. The counter where she had left it the previous evening was bare. The pale outline of dust still marked its absence, but the volume itself had vanished as completely as if it had never been there. Mr. Farnsworth was behind the counter, his manner a shade too composed. "Ah, Miss Marple, looking for something?" "Yes," she said cheerfully. "I'd hoped to see that charming blue book again. I do so hate when things go missing." His smile was thin. "I'm afraid I don't know which you mean. Our stock moves quickly. Customers rarely come at night," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "and rarer still without leaving a note of sale." Farnsworth's eyes tightened just slightly. Price appeared from the back room, dust on his sleeves. "The inspector's been by already," he blurted, then stopped, as if realizing he'd said too much. "Oh?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "And did he take anything with him?" Price hesitated. "No, not that I saw." Mrs. Broom emerged just then with a tray of tea, her expression neutral. Yet when she placed the cups down, her hands trembled almost imperceptibly. Miss Marple noticed the faint smell of scorched paper drifting from her sleeves. The pieces fell into place. Not the solution, not yet, but the movement of hands behind the curtain. Someone had realized the danger of that book and had acted quickly. It was not merely hidden. Miss Marple suspected it was destroyed. She walked slowly toward the loft. The seal on De Occultis Mortis had been broken. The book now lay slightly askew on the desk, and the faintest ash smudge marked the floor nearby. Someone had opened it again, perhaps to ensure no incriminating traces remained. When she descended, Farnsworth was pretending to study an inventory. Price had vanished into the storeroom. Mrs. Broom busied herself with polishing, her rag moving in quick, nervous circles. Miss Marple's voice remained calm, but her eyes were bright. It is so unfortunate when evidence disappears. One begins to feel as though it is not only books that are being tidied away, but truths. Farnsworth said nothing. Mrs. Broom looked up sharply, then down again. Miss Marple turned toward the door, adjusting her gloves. "Of course," she said mildly. "The curious thing about the truth is that it tends to reappear in the most unexpected places, even when one thinks it has been burned to ash." She left the shop, her expression serene but her mind entirely alert. Someone inside was working quickly, not just to conceal the crime, but to erase its very shape. And if they were willing to risk destroying evidence, then they were growing desperate. Desperation, in Miss Marple's experience, was when people made their most dangerous mistakes. That evening, St. Mildred's lay under a low, restless fog. The gas lamps burned dimly in the streets, their glow swallowed by the mist. Miss Marple had returned to her small lodgings, her knitting in her lap, when a knock sounded at the door. It was Price, pale and wide-eyed. "Miss Marple, you'd best come quick. It's Mr. Farnsworth. He's gone." Miss Marple rose at once, her manner calm, but her mind racing. "Gone?" "Vanished," Price stammered. "The shop's locked from the outside, lights all out. Mrs. Broom's in a state." Miss Marple followed him through the fog-slick streets. When they reached the shop, Mrs. Broom was pacing in front, wringing her hands. He didn't say a word. One moment he was in the back room, the next, nothing. His coat's still here, his hat too, and the cash box is untouched. Miss Marple's eyes went at once to the door. A fine dusting of ash lay along the threshold, as though someone had brushed past in a hurry. Inside, the shop felt strangely hollow, the quiet disturbed only by the faint creak of the loft stairs. Miss Marple ascended slowly. The loft was as it had been, except the black-bound De Occultis Mortis was gone. Below, Mrs. Broom called out sharply, "Miss Marple, come quickly." Miss Marple descended to find her standing near the counter, staring at a folded slip of paper left in plain view. Mrs. Broom's face was ashen. Miss Marple took the note gently. The handwriting was sharp and deliberate. One book claimed another. Leave it be. There was no signature. Inspector Graves arrived within the hour, more flustered than Miss Marple had ever seen him. First Hartwell dead, now Farnsworth missing, and the blasted book gone. "Someone's playing games with us." Miss Marple, serene as ever, said only, "Games have rules, Inspector. And players. The trick is knowing which is which." Price sat on a stool in the corner, his head in his hands. "I told him not to mess with it. I told him." "Told him what?" Graves barked. "That book. Hartwell wanted it, Ellery wanted it, even Farnsworth wanted it. They all said it was valuable, but it was more than that. It was dangerous. Something about the missing page. Farnsworth said if the page stayed missing, no one could use it properly. But Hartwell found out. And now..." His words dissolved into nervous silence. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind turned sharp. The disappearance was not a flight of guilt. It was the second move in a game she had begun to see clearly. The book had always been the key, but the page was the lock that controlled it. She looked toward Mrs. Broom, who was unusually quiet now, her hands still, her eyes fixed on the empty counter. Miss Marple spoke gently. I believe, Mrs. Broom, that we are running out of time. When a story moves into its final chapter, things tend to happen quickly. And in her mind, she was already certain. Another move would come soon, whether it was another death, another disappearance, or another deception. The villain was still ahead of them, just far enough to make the next step the most dangerous one yet. The fog had not lifted by morning. St. Mildred's was wrapped in a pale shroud, as if the town itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple walked to the bookshop slowly, her mind turning over every step of the strange dance they had been led through. Hartwell dead in a locked loft, Ellery accused, the blue book vanishing, Farnsworth disappearing with the De Occultis Mortis. Inside, the shop felt strangely expectant. Mrs. Broom was polishing the counter with her usual briskness, though her eyes were distant. Price sat behind the counter, staring at nothing in particular. Miss Marple glanced about the room with her usual air of mild curiosity, though her thoughts were anything but casual. It was at that moment she saw it, the smallest thing, but it stopped her entirely. On the counter sat a teacup. Not unusual in itself, except that it was on the left side of the ledger. Farnsworth was right-handed. Miss Marple remembered clearly. She had seen him write. Pour tea, shelve books, all with his right hand. But Price, the boy who now sat nervously fidgeting with a pen, was left-handed. Her eyes narrowed slightly. She thought back. Every movement, every comment. Price had been the one to carry news of Farnsworth's disappearance, yet he had never looked surprised. He had been in the shop every time something vanished, the blue book, the page, even Farnsworth himself. And then there was Mrs. Broom, who had been here longer than anyone. 20 years, she had said, long enough to see Hartwell and Ellery's father quarrel over the De Occultis Mortis. And yet, she had never once mentioned her opinion of Farnsworth. It was as though she had carefully excised him from every story. The pattern settled in Miss Marple's mind like a puzzle snapping into place. The missing page, the vanished book, Farnsworth's disappearance. They were not random at all. They were the careful movements of someone who understood the shop's habits, its stock, and its people. Someone who could move freely in and out without drawing suspicion. Someone who knew how to tidy things away so they were gone before anyone noticed. Her gaze moved to Mrs. Broom's hands. Steady now, but just yesterday they had smelled faintly of scorched paper. The blue book had not been stolen by an intruder. It had been removed by someone who lived among it every day. Miss Marple's voice was mild as she spoke. "I was thinking of your remark, Mrs. Broom, about seeing Mr. Hartwell here 15 years ago, and Ellery's father, too. You do have a remarkable memory." Mrs. Broom looked up, startled. "I see what I see, Miss Marple." "Yes, and I suspect you saw rather a lot more than you have said. I think you saw who took the blue book. I think you know where Farnsworth is. In fact, I suspect you may have helped him, though perhaps not in the way you intended." The room grew very still. Price shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting to Mrs. Broom. Miss Marple turned her gaze on him. "And you, Mr. Price, you've been in this shop for only a short time, yet you seem to know quite a lot about its most dangerous books. Odd for an assistant to speak of missing pages and old quarrels unless someone has told him, or unless he's had a hand in moving them himself." Price swallowed hard. "I didn't. I was just—" Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her bag. "The truth is quite a simple pattern, Mr. Price, but like most patterns, it is only visible once all the pieces are set in place. We have been looking for a villain in shadows when, in fact, everything has been happening in the light of day, right here in this very shop." Her tone remained mild, but her eyes were keen. "It is not the book that holds the danger, Inspector Graves will be pleased to learn. It is the people who have fought for it, then and now, and the missing page, I suspect, has been much closer than any of us realized." Price's face blanched. Mrs. Broom's polishing cloth stilled in her hand. Miss Marple folded her gloves neatly. The shape of the truth had come into focus. Now it was only a matter of showing it to everyone else. The shop was quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock above the counter. Miss Marple sat with her knitting in her lap, her gaze resting, lightly but firmly, on Mrs. Broom and Price. "It is the oddest thing," she began conversationally, "how people imagine crimes are committed for the same reasons we see in novels. Money, jealousy, some tidy little quarrel. But in truth, it is very often something older. Something no one would think worth killing for, except the person who does." Mrs. Broom's hands tightened on her polishing cloth. Price looked away, his jaw tense. Miss Marple continued, her tone still gentle, as though she were telling a story to children. 15 years ago, Mr. Hartwell came here for the occultus mortis. He was not the only one. Ellery's father wanted it too. And Mr. Farnsworth, even then, was caught in the middle. But what none of them realized was that the most determined guardian of that book was not a dealer or collector at all. It was someone who dusted its covers every week and watched them quarrel from the corner. Mrs. Broom's breath caught, just enough to be heard. "You see," Miss Marple said softly, "Mrs. Broom, you were here when Ellery's father ruined your sister. She worked for him, quietly, faithfully, and he left her penniless when his affairs collapsed. I expect she confided in you before she died. Perhaps she even told you that De Occultis Mortis had been her last errand, delivering it to Farnsworth, who promised to keep it safe." Mrs. Broom's face had paled, but her voice was steady. "You know nothing about it." "Oh, on the contrary," Miss Marple said kindly. "I know everything. I know why you kept the book here all these years, why you never allowed it to be sold. And I know why Hartwell's return frightened you, because Hartwell had discovered the missing page and intended to sell it to Ellery. The page your sister carried, the page you kept hidden, until recently." Her gaze shifted to Price. "And you, Mr. Price, you were the eager apprentice. Mrs. Broom trusted you, perhaps even thought you would protect the book as she had. But you saw an opportunity, whether for profit or for leverage over Farnsworth, and you took the page." Price's face flushed. "I didn't kill him." "No," Miss Marple agreed, her voice as soft as falling ash. "But you set the chain of events in motion. Hartwell confronted Farnsworth. Farnsworth confronted you. And Mrs. Broom, seeing her sister's last trust about to be sold, took steps to ensure Hartwell would never leave the loft alive." There was silence, deep and thick. Mrs. Broom set the cloth down very carefully. "He wasn't supposed to die," she said at last, her voice low. "I only meant to frighten him. But he'd been ill. Weak heart, they said, and the belladonna was too much." Miss Marple nodded, her face kind, though her words were precise. "You wanted to protect your sister's memory. That is why you burned the page when you realized Farnsworth was gone. That is why you removed the blue book. It was never about money or power, Mrs. Broom. It was about loyalty. And perhaps a little vengeance." Mrs. Broom looked down at her hands. Price stared at her, pale and stunned, perhaps realizing for the first time that the loyalty he'd relied on came from a much deeper wound than he had understood. Miss Marple gathered her knitting. "The law will do what it must, of course. But I have lived long enough to know that some motives are born of grief, and grief does not excuse, but it does explain." The room was still as Inspector Graves' footsteps sounded outside. The time for secrets was ending. The truth, messy, old, and full of human frailty, had at last been brought into the light. Inspector Graves arrived moments later, his boots striking the shop floor with the self-assured heaviness of a man who thought the case had already been tied up neatly. Twice. Miss Marple, seated as calmly as a guest at tea, did not immediately contradict him. "Inspector," she said pleasantly, "how good of you to come. I believe we are now in a position to settle this matter once and for all." Graves gave her a look that was half wariness, half exasperation. "You've something, then, because I've no patience left for more riddles about flowers and dusty old books." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, it is quite simple now. We have a vanished man, a vanished book, and a page that no longer exists. But what we have in abundance are habits. Small, unremarkable habits that tell us exactly who did what and why." Price shifted in his chair, his face pale. Mrs. Broom stood very still behind the counter, her hands folded. Miss Marple began in her mild, almost grandmotherly tone. "Mr. Price, I should like to thank you for being so helpful these last few days. You see, every time something went missing, you were here to tell us so. That in itself is quite a feat." Price blurted out, "I didn't take the book." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied gently. "You didn't take the book, because Mrs. Broom had already removed it. Just as she removed the page. She acted because she feared Mr. Hartwell would trade it to Miss Ellery and destroy what she had guarded for 15 years. And Mr. Farnsworth, well, his disappearance was merely the last untidy bit of the matter." Mrs. Broom's eyes flickered. "He left because he was frightened," she said flatly. "Ah, Miss," Marple said, knitting a few stitches, "but frightened men take their coats, their hats, and their money. Mr. Farnsworth left none of these behind, which suggests that he did not leave at all, at least not under his own arrangement." Graves looked sharply at Mrs. Broom. "Are you saying you know where he is?" Mrs. Broom hesitated. Her silence was almost an admission. Miss Marple looked at her with great kindness. "You see, Mrs. Broom, loyalty can be a noble thing, but it can also be a trap of its own making. Farnsworth used your loyalty to shield himself. He let you bear the risk for Hartwell's death. And when you destroyed the page to protect your sister's memory, he slipped away, leaving you to tidy up once again." Something shifted in Mrs. Broom's expression. The years of quiet service, of holding her grief close, seemed to harden into something heavier. Miss Marple's voice remained steady. "It is time to call things by their proper names. Mr. Farnsworth will not return here of his own accord. But if you tell the inspector where to find him, you will no longer carry the whole of this burden alone." Mrs. Broom's shoulders sagged. For a moment, the shop was silent except for the ticking clock. Then she spoke, her voice low. "He's at the old binder's shop in Bath. Said he'd stay there until things cooled down, said he'd come back when it was safe." Graves straightened, already signaling for an officer. Price looked at Mrs. Broom in stunned disbelief. "You helped him?" Her look was sharp and tired. "I kept this shop running when neither of you could see straight. Don't talk to me about helping." Miss Marple's voice was soft, but it carried. "And that, I think, is the end of the story, the truth of it at least. What the law will do now is no longer ours to arrange." Graves, still slightly baffled at how the pieces had so suddenly aligned, gave Miss Marple a grudging nod. "You've got the devil's own way of putting things in order, madam." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not the devil's inspector, just a lifetime's acquaintance with human nature." And with that, the final trap was sprung, not by force, but by the quiet inevitability of the truth, laid bare where there was no longer anywhere for it to hide. Inspector Graves returned from Bath 3 days later with a triumphant look that seemed almost foreign on his usually stolid face. "We've got him, Miss Marple. Farnsworth's in custody. Says he's got nothing to do with Hartwell's death, but we'll see how long that lasts. Case closed." Miss Marple, seated in her favorite chair near the fire in her lodgings, looked up mildly from her knitting. "Case closed? My dear Inspector, I should think you'd know by now that cases are like books. One ought never to declare them finished before turning the very last page." Graves frowned, but before he could respond, there was another knock at the door. It was Price, breathless and pale. "Miss Marple, you have to come. There's something you need to see. In the shop." Within minutes, she was back at Farnsworth's antiquarian books. The familiar smell of dust and ink greeted her, but something new lingered in the air, a faint, acrid scent of candle wax and scorched fabric. Mrs. Broom stood at the counter, her hands steady, her face unreadable. Before her lay an opened ledger, the very same ledger Miss Marple had noticed earlier in the investigation. Except now, tucked inside its cover, was a folded slip of paper. Price's voice trembled. "I was sorting the accounts, like you asked. This was hidden in the binding." Miss Marple unfolded the paper. Written in Farnsworth's sharp, precise hand were the words, "The Hartwell matter will draw them off. Keep your silence, and we can still see the book safely sold once the fuss dies down." P. Graves, who had followed close behind, frowned deeply. "P. Price." Price's face went white. "No, I never. He's lying. He's trying to pin this on me." Miss Marple's expression was serene, though her mind was turning quickly. "Oh, I don't think it's Price at all," she said softly. "The handwriting, Inspector. It's Farnsworth's, but the phrasing. We can still see the book safely sold. That isn't a Price. Price was never a partner, only a tool." Her gaze shifted, ever so slightly, to Mrs. Broom. Mrs. Broom's voice was calm. He was trying to save his own skin. He'd have blamed anyone. "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "But the letter was not meant to incriminate. It was meant to reassure. And that P at the end, it's not an initial. It's a sign. In old ledgers, P often meant paid. Farnsworth was telling his true partner that payment, whether money or safety, would be secured." There was a long silence. Miss Marple continued, her voice calm but certain. "And the true partner, the one who moved the book, who burned the page, who protected Farnsworth even when she thought she was protecting her sister's memory, was you, Mrs. Broom. But not as a servant or guardian, as his equal." Mrs. Broom looked at her steadily, the mask slipping at last. "And if it was? Hartwell was a vulture. Ellery's father ruined my sister. Farnsworth and I kept that book safe for years. It was never about profit, until they all tried to take it." Graves stepped forward, but Miss Marple lifted a hand. Her voice remained even. "Oh, I have no doubt your intentions began nobly. But the trouble with secrets, Mrs. Broom, is that they grow heavy. Farnsworth thought to leave you to carry the weight alone. That is why he went to Bath. And that is why he left you the note, to bind you one last time." Mrs. Broom's expression softened, just faintly, as though the truth of that struck somewhere deeper than any accusation could reach. Miss Marple leaned on her parasol. "The law will decide what to do now. But at least, Mrs. Broom, you needn't tidy up anyone else's mess again." Graves moved in, and for a moment Mrs. Broom looked as if she might resist. But then she simply straightened her shoulders, a strange calm settling over her. As she was led away, Miss Marple watched quietly, her knitting folded neatly in her lap. The case was closed now, or as closed as such things ever were, but she could not help thinking, as she stepped out into the cold St. Mildred's air, that there were still pieces of the truth scattered like pages missing from a book. Pieces no one might ever find, and perhaps that was for the best. The trial at St. Mildred's Assizes drew a quiet but steady crowd, most of them more curious than shocked. Mrs. Broom sat in the dock, her back straight, her face calm. Farnsworth was brought from Bath under guard, his usual composure replaced by a gaunt defiance. The Crown presented its case with precision. The death of Hartwell, the vanished De Occultis Mortis, the burnt page, and the discovery of Farnsworth in hiding. Yet for all the orderly sequence of events, the truth had been far from orderly, and it fell to Miss Marple, called by the Crown, to set the threads in their proper place. She took the stand with her characteristic quietness, hands folded lightly. The courtroom leaned in, as it always did when she began to speak. "You see, it was never about the book alone. she began gently. It was about what the book represented. To Mr. Hartwell it was profit. To Miss Ellery's father it was possession. To Mr. Farnsworth it was reputation, his standing as a man who could deliver rare works to serious collectors. But to Mrs. Broom it was loyalty. It was the last promise she could keep to her sister. She let the silence hang for a moment before continuing. The missing page was key. Without it, the book was valuable but incomplete. Hartwell discovered where it had gone, and he came here to claim it. Mrs. Broom, afraid of losing the last connection to her sister's trust, confronted him. Her intention was to frighten him away, but Hartwell's weak heart turned the confrontation into tragedy. Her eyes moved briefly to Farnsworth. Mr. Farnsworth discovered the truth quickly, and he realized the page could still be of use to him, not as a piece of occult literature, but as leverage. He persuaded Mrs. Broom to keep quiet and concealed the book himself, planning to sell it when suspicion had moved on. His disappearance was no escape from danger, but a calculated pause to let matters settle. The prosecutor prompted, "And the evidence, Miss Marple? What led you to these conclusions?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. The evidence was never hidden. It was in the habits. Mr. Farnsworth's neatness, leaving coat, hat, and money behind, which no man fleeing danger would do. Mrs. Broom's careful avoidance of his name when speaking of the past. Mr. Price's nervous interruptions, which were less about guilt than fear of what the others might reveal. And the blue book, always moved, never stolen, as though it belonged to the shop as firmly as the walls themselves. She folded her hands. People overlook habits because they are so ordinary, but ordinary things are the threads that bind a pattern together. Once you see the pattern, the truth is as clear as a printed page. The verdict came 2 days later. Farnsworth was convicted of conspiracy to obstruct justice and fraudulent dealings. Mrs. Broom of manslaughter. Price was spared formal charges, but quietly dismissed from the shop. Justice of a kind had been served. And yet, as Miss Marple walked away from the courthouse, her step unhurried, she felt that faint, familiar unease. Farnsworth had spoken of other buyers, of arrangements made long before Hartwell's death. The De Occultis Mortis had been recovered, but she could not help but notice that its first page bore a different watermark than the rest, as though it too had once been replaced. Perhaps the true heart of the book lay elsewhere. Perhaps another hand, far from St. Mildred's, was turning its pages even now. Miss Marple tightened her shawl against the wind. The case was closed. Sufficiently, at least. But like so many things in life, it left 1 or 2 threads dangling, and that, she thought, was only natural. The afternoon after the trial, St. Mildred seemed to settle back into its quiet rhythm, as though the town were eager to tuck away its scandal like an untidy book back on the shelf. Farnsworth's antiquarian books reopened under the nervous hand of a temporary manager sent by the estate. The front windows gleamed with freshly polished glass, the counters wiped clean of dust, but for all its orderly appearance, the shop felt hollow. Miss Marple stopped by on her way home from the courthouse. She had no real errand, only a certain fondness for endings that felt properly finished. She stepped inside and let her eyes travel over the familiar shelves, each row exactly as it should be. Exactly, and yet not. In the loft, De Occultis Mortis lay under lock and key, its black leather unmarked. The recovered, missing page, preserved by the crown, was now tucked neatly inside. But Miss Marple's eyes paused on the front flyleaf. A faint inscription in Latin had been added in a different hand, older ink. She bent closer, murmuring softly to herself. The words translated loosely to, "The first page is never the beginning. Seek where the story was bound before." Miss Marple straightened slowly, her knitting bag on her arm. It was, she supposed, only an old collector's note, some cryptic remark left by an owner who liked riddles. And yet the thought lingered. Downstairs, Price, now packing the last of his belongings, caught her eye. "Miss Marple," he said hesitantly. They never did say who Hartwell meant to sell the page to, or why Ellery's father wanted the book so badly in the first place. "No," Miss Marple agreed gently. They didn't. Price hesitated as though he might ask more, but instead he only nodded and left, the door closing softly behind him. Miss Marple stepped out into the cool afternoon air. The mist had begun to roll in from the river again, softening the edges of the street. She walked slowly, her mind turning over the odd Latin note, the changed watermark on the first page, and the fact that some mysteries, like some books, were never truly finished. The case at Farnsworth's was closed. St. Mildred's could breathe again, but Miss Marple knew as well as anyone that books have sequels, and stories have a way of continuing long after the last word is read. And somewhere, perhaps far from St. Mildred's, someone was turning another page. She tightened her shawl against the chill, her eyes bright with quiet curiosity. A mystery had ended, but another, she felt sure, was already waiting. "Would you like me to compile the entire Miss Marple mystery, the bookshop of black magic and death, into one seamless, continuous story so it reads as a single, polished novel without breaks? This would smooth all transitions and make it flow like a complete book."